Welcome to the Menopause Mindset Podcast, the place to get some answers and feel supported along this often bumpy journey. Many people sail through menopause, but many people don't. And so my guests and I are here to motivate you and inspire you so that you can make menopause a happier transition for yourself and for your loved ones. I'm Sally Garozzo and I'm an award-winning rapid transformational therapist, a menopause educator and the founder of the Sleep Superpower Academy. So without further ado, let's dive in. So my guest today is a certified holistic nutritional consultant and an instructor at the Canadian School of Natural Nutrition. She's also the proud recipient of the 2018 Clinical Excellence Award and co-founder and co-author of Histamine Haven. She has a strong interest in supporting brain plasticity, as well as helping people struggling with histamine intolerance and Mast Cell Activation Syndrome. So Tracey Reed, welcome to the podcast today.
Thank you. I am so excited to be here, and especially to kind of follow up. I know you've had a conversation with my colleague Luka to follow up and add more to this conversation.
Absolutely. So Luka came on back in May. I think it was episode 103. And the thing that really struck me was this link between histamine and anxiety, and this idea that a body that doesn't feel safe will likely, not always, but likely experience more histamine or mast cell activation, which I'm sure you'll go into today. And it was a real penny drop moment for me, because since then I've really been looking at my own symptoms and the way that I feel on a daily basis, actually. And I know I've recently been through some trauma, and with everything being so dysregulated and feeling really quite unsafe at times, I've noticed, my tummy just couldn't tolerate, high histamine foods. I became more itchy. My sleep was disrupted, and all those kind of histamine type symptoms sort of came to the surface. And then as my nervous system started feeling better and I started feeling safer, all the symptoms have started diminishing as well, which is so incredibly interesting. So the link to me has been mind-blowing, and that's why I'm so excited to talk to you further today, Tracey, because I really want to develop this conversation. So before we start, I would love to know more about you and what your histamine story is, what that penny drop moment for you was, and what your histamine issues have been. So let's start there.
Yeah, so for me, I've had issues since childhood. And I think the thing that stands out really well for me, like from a very, very early time in my life, is I always had skin issues. So I had rashes that came and went, and nobody really knew why. Sometimes I would get hives. And again, the doctors didn't really have any explanation. I was always itchy. My mom was trying every lotion on the market, but I was just always kind of itchy. Sometimes I'd have eczema, and again, it would sort of just seem to resolve itself eventually. And the other thing from childhood was chemical sensitivities. So chemical sensitivities, for people who aren't familiar with it, this is when you react to smells, but mostly things like perfumes, or maybe the smell of gasoline, or paint smells, those types of odors. And so what stands out really, really clearly for me is my dad always had a new car. So I don't think this really gets done as much anymore, but back then you would have a company car. So he'd always have this new car, and I would feel just fine in my mom's old Beater, but in my dad's new car, which was off-gassing all of these chemicals from the plastics, I would feel nauseated and headachy. So those were sort of the two main things in my childhood. And then I hit adolescence, and I know you and Luka talked a lot about the estrogen histamine connection. And so this is where a lot of people, like during significant hormonal changes, this is where a lot of people get a flare in symptoms. And this was certainly the case for me as well. So everything I'd been dealing with sort of escalated, all the skin issues escalated. And in fact, I developed eczema on my hands that would plague me for the next 40 years. But I also developed things like exercise-induced asthma, cold-induced asthma. Like I said, this eczema was really, really bad. It was a blistering type of eczema. So my hands would always just kind of be oozing because these blisters were bursting. And of course, PMS, that was quite debilitating, really severe cramping. And so then, even though I had all of these symptoms, I really couldn't say that any of them were severely impacting my quality of life at that point. So they were annoying. I was managing the eczema with a cortisone cream, which really wasn't my first choice, but I tried all kinds of other things and nothing was really managing it. But then, I went through university, I got a job, and I was teaching in a residential care facility, and it was kind of an older building. And I started developing nausea and fatigue. So quite debilitating nausea and fatigue, where it felt like I had the flu, but there was no fever. And I didn't really understand what was going on, but I was missing a couple of days every month due to this extreme fatigue and nausea. And in between these bouts, I would be, quite healthy, active, functioning very well. Then I moved to Korea. And Korea is a very hot, humid country, and a lot of buildings have mold. And mold can be an incredible trigger for histamine and mast cell issues. And in Korea, I became really, really ill. I was nauseated and exhausted almost all of the time. I developed a bullseye rash all over my torso. So these big red circular sort of eczema spots, as well as eczema on my face. And again, I still didn't really know what was going on. I was seeing different practitioners. Came back to Canada and, things started to improve and resolve. Again, was exploring things with a whole bunch of practitioners. And, fast tracked then through a few decades, and life was just kind of normal, managing my symptoms. And I went and studied nutrition. And my third child is adopted from China, and he was extremely malnourished in infancy. And so when I finished my nutritional studies, I knew there was a protocol that could help him. So because he was so malnourished in infancy, his brain had not developed. So he had a lot of developmental, a lot of cognitive delays. So I became certified in a protocol called the GAPS diet. And the GAPS diet is all about repairing the gut, healing and sealing the gut to help the brain so this is via the gut-brain axis. So being the good mom that I was, I was like, I'm going to do this with my son to support him. And so I started on this protocol, and I was starting to see improvements in some of my symptoms. So my eczema was actually getting better, but I developed a couple of new symptoms. I developed nerve tingling down my right leg, and I developed urinary urgency. And the urinary urgency, I didn't talk about it for years because it's kind of an embarrassing thing to talk about. And I knew it wasn't a pelvic floor issue. I had a really, really strong pelvic floor, so I knew that wasn't the case. So here I was eating. So part of the GAPS protocol is eating all of these fermented foods. And so I was increasing my intake of fermented foods, and that's what was causing the urinary urgency and the nerve tingling in my leg. So nobody was talking about histamine, not anywhere in my education had I heard about it. There was a little bit of talk about it within the GAPS community with other practitioners. So I started to explore if this was an issue for me. And then I had some really big questions. Was I not breaking down histamine? Was I not clearing it through my liver? Did I have something called mast cell activation syndrome? And I had clients who had mast cell activation syndrome. And so this is where I started to kind of question, is this actually me? So I needed to find a doctor who was skilled and experienced in mast cell activation syndrome. And I was very, very lucky that we have one here in Calgary, where I'm from. And I was able to get the diagnosis. So the light bulb moment for me was that urinary urgency. I just have this vision of myself. So I'm in Canada where we have snowy winters. So I envision myself, I'm all bundled up in my, winter coat and boots, and I'm standing at the front door. I've rushed home from wherever I'm at because I have to pee so badly. And I'm standing there like a little kid trying to unlock the door with my legs crossed. Little kids do that to hold their pee in. And I would I'd get inside, I would leave my coat and my boots on and rush to the bathroom. And I usually didn't make it. I would start trickling pee before I could hit the toilet seat. And so, obviously not something you want to happen in public. Often there'd be a trickle of urine on my pants. So yeah, that was really the thing. I think that was kind of that light bulb moment for me where like, yeah, this could be a histamine issue.
Wow. Okay. So lots of different symptoms, but mainly, the whole sort of nutrition thing instigated from having a son, an adopted son who was malnourished, and that set you on
Hmm.
this path of
Yes.
doing the whole healthy diet thing. Because we think it's healthy to eat all these fermented foods, but actually, if there's a mast cell issue, they might not be healthy. So,
Yeah.
can you talk a little bit more about what mast cell activation syndrome is?
Yes. Yes. So I'll try to differentiate between histamine intolerance and mast cell activation syndrome because I think many people think they have histamine intolerance when in fact they may actually have mast cell activation syndrome. So I'll try to shed a little bit of light on that. So mast cells are a cell in your immune system. And in fact, they're probably the most important cell in the immune system. So I think Luka talked about how, from an evolutionary perspective, these were the first mast cells, mammals. This was the first the first immune cell that mammals had. And as such, it had to do many, many, many different jobs. So it is a very, very complex cell. We know there are over 200 different chemical mediators that it houses, and people are now talking about it having over 1,000. And so the thing to understand about a mast cell is that it is a master of signaling. It's a master of communication. And so all of these chemical mediators that it houses, that is how it communicates to other cells in the body.
What's a chemical mediator?
So a chemical mediator, histamine is one example of one. But we could even look at hormones, sex hormones or thyroid hormones as a chemical mediator. There's tryptase, heparin, like there's all these interleukins, a whole bunch of different cytokines, peptides, like there's so many different things. But basically, it is a substance that is able to signal something to other cells in the body.
Okay. Okay. So it signals something to the mast cell, and the mast cell does something based on this signal from one of these
Yeah, and
chemicals.
any cell in the body, in fact. So the mast cell. So I'll use histamine as an example because this one I think most people understand. Most people are familiar with an allergy, whether they themselves struggle with an allergy or they know somebody else who does. So when you have an allergic response, your mast cells are the cells that are responsible for that. So they release histamine, and it's the histamine that is resulting in the symptoms that you associate with your allergy. So the runny eyes, sneezing, itchy nose, wheezing, whatever those symptoms might be. So that's histamine is signaling the cells in your nasal passages and your upper airway, and in your eyes to produce those symptoms. But mast cells, because they have hundreds, if not, over 1,000 of these mediators, the potential for miscommunication is also huge. And so what happens with mast cell activation syndrome is that these cells are releasing mediators inappropriately.
Okay.
And so often these cells have become sensitized and they are more sensitive to stimuli. So say, for example, stress is a big trigger for everything, right? So say in a normal person, you have a little bit of stress that will trigger a mast cell response. Normally, that's part of a normal, healthy stress response. But if your mast cells are sensitized, a little bit of stress can suddenly result in seemingly unrelated symptoms, right? Skin symptoms, GI symptoms, pain, brain fog, headache, migraine, right? Like the list of symptoms, as you know, is extensive. And this is why we haven't really talked about this, but every single person who has mast cell activation syndrome will have a completely different symptom profile because it is dependent on what mediators are being released from the mast cell.
Okay. So how do you then discover that you've got a mast cell activation problem if the symptoms are so varied and vast?
Yeah. So this is an excellent question because doctors don't recognize mast cell activation syndrome. One, they have not been educated in it. So, they know mast cells are involved in allergy. That is probably the extent of their education with regards to mast cells. So this makes it incredibly frustrating for people who are seeking an answer when they're struggling with all of this. So I think people have to really be a very strong advocate for themselves. If you have, again, if you're an individual and you have a collection of symptoms, and if you may even have a collection of diagnoses. You may have diagnoses like chronic fatigue, fibromyalgia, IBS. So there's about 11% of IBS that can have mast cell activation as its root. Asthma would certainly be another one. But if you sort of have a collection of diagnoses or this collection of symptoms, and you're wanting to understand what that connection is between all of them, that's just something to think about. The other thing I would consider, most people with mast cell activation syndrome, and this would be sort of a red flag for people to think, oh, maybe this is me. Maybe I have mast cell activation syndrome. Most people with mast cell activation syndrome will have some kind of sensitivity. So I shared with you how I'm sensitive to smells and, things like perfumes. I'll share the things that I'm sensitive to, and then I'll build on that list. So another thing I struggle with is herbal supplements. So herbal supplements, often when I try them, things kind of go sideways. They just don't work the way they're supposed to. I have unexpected results from taking them. So, now I stay away from herbal supplements. Same thing for medications. Many people with MCAS, so MCAS is the acronym for mast cell activation syndrome. Many people don't do well with medications. They, again, might just seem really, really sensitive to that medication. And often it's not the actual pharmaceutical component, the drug component that they're reacting to. They may be reacting to, binders, colors, all these different excipients that are in pharmaceutical drugs. So that's another kind of red flag. You might be sensitive to heat. So a lot of people don't do well with heat or temperature changes, or weather changes. So when the atmospheric pressure changes, so the thing that stands out most for me is those people that get a migraine with weather changes. What else? Bright lights, certain sounds, again, like any kind of sensitivity, but probably the biggest ones I think would be like temperature, heat, chemical sensitivities. There's really good research actually suggesting that if you have chemical sensitivities, that you have mast cell activation syndrome. But other things like even emotional states. So we talked a little bit about stress, but again, if you're that person who you're maybe going through stress or a heightened emotional experience, and suddenly you get other symptoms, hives, or whatever the case may be. Also EMFs. So EMFs are electromagnetic fields. We are inundated with them now. So how would people know if they're sensitive to EMFs? If you're holding a cell phone and you maybe notice symptoms in your hand, nerve tingling, maybe you get headaches when you're using your cell phone. If you notice symptoms are getting worse or arising when you're spending a lot of time on the computer, that would be another scenario. And then I mentioned that when I was in Korea, things really flared for me, and mold is a huge trigger. And I've only recognized that now in hindsight, but I think when I was a teacher working in this old building, there was some mold probably in that building too, which is why I started feeling bad when I was working there. Yeah, and even things like vibration. Like I've heard of people mountain biking, and when mountain biking, you're kind of right, you're going down the hill and breaking out in hives after that kind of vibration. And I've heard even of women like the friction of clothing. So where your bra strap might be rubbing, you might get some skin irritation or even hives there. So there's so many sensitivities. But that would be a big red flag for mast cell activation syndrome. If you have some kind of sensitivity along with a collection of symptoms that are, across body systems, right? So maybe you have some skin issues and maybe you have some GI issues, for example. That's when I would start to consider MCAS.
Whew,
That was a long.
that's really given me a lot to think about, because I've only had 2 operations in my life, but I'm very sensitive to anesthetic.
Mm,
And I'm always sensitive to, painkillers and medications. And I'm like, I don't really trust it. What's it going to do to me? I'm going to have an overreaction to it. So I wonder if there's something, something around that as well. And also, since hitting perimenopause quite deeply, I'm deep in perimenopause now. I can't tolerate my husband's aftershave. I cannot put perfume on me anymore.
yeah.
Cannot. I have to wear rubber gloves and a mask if I'm wanting to de-lime scale the shower. I cannot breathe that stuff in. I literally have to open the windows, and it's too much. And become very sensitive to the flat that I live in because of the traffic noise and the fact that I'm not on the ground floor and things like that. So everything that you're saying is really making me think about a mast cell involvement and how actually it's it could be something like that. And how does menopause heighten this sensitivity?
Yeah. So what you have just described, I'm at the exact same stage you are. So yeah, my husband, we've been so careful. Like this has been an issue for me always. But suddenly, the shaving cream that he uses, I've started reacting to. And he's like, well, you didn't used to react to it. I'm like, well, I am now. So with perimenopause, the first hormone that we start to see declining is progesterone. Progesterone. So we talked about how mast cells release all these signaling molecules, but they also communicate with other cells in the body. So progesterone comes and it signals to the mast cell to stop releasing histamine. So when we lose that progesterone, we now have lost essentially the brakes on histamine. And then now we've got a little bit more histamine in our system, and that actually signals the ovaries to make more estrogen. And then the estrogen signals to the mast cells. So estrogen is the opposite of progesterone. It actually signals the release of histamine. So then we have this vicious cycle. And I think the real issue in perimenopause is the estrogen dominance, right? As the progesterone is waning, we have this estrogen dominance. And so then we just have this vicious cycle where mast cells are continually releasing histamine.
Okay.
Yeah.
And is there any other cause for this sensitivity other than menopause?
Yes. Yes. So the one of the there you know, I talked about mold being a trigger for me, but there are many triggers. There's a lot of infections that can be triggers. So Lyme disease, Bartonella, Borrelia, all the co-infections that we often see with Lyme. COVID is another one. SIBO. So SIBO is an acronym for small intestinal bacterial overgrowth. There are parasites. So a bunch of different infections could trigger it. Again, mast cells are trying to keep you safe. So if they perceive a situation where they don't think you're safe, this could lead to this trigger. And there are genetic variations on mast cells in individuals that have mast cell activation syndrome. So that's a piece of it. So infections can make the mast cells not feel safe. Trauma, such a huge topic. I'm sure we won't even do it justice today, but trauma, if your mom experienced trauma while she was pregnant with you, that can actually initiate a mast cell response in the fetus. So for me, I was a premature baby. So I was separated from my mom at birth, put in an incubator. She was told to go home. So I think that was probably a really big trigger for me. And my mom had lost a baby before she conceived me. So there was that fear through her pregnancy with me that, this baby might be lost as well. So that sort of fear and stress, I think, again, could have impacted my mast cells. Intergenerational trauma. So, were your ancestors in a war, or did they have to flee a country, or was there sexual abuse in the past in your family? So all of this stuff epigenetically can impact the mast cells. And so what the researchers have shown with mast cell activation syndrome is that there are genetic variations in people who have MCAS, but they're not acquired. So it's not like a hereditary variation that's passed on. It seems to be an epigenetic acquisition of these changes. And so then we have to look at what has happened in the environment of that individual or their ancestors that could have made mast cells feel unsafe. And I could talk about this forever, but we think of stress and this feeling of not being safe, of being threatened or in danger as an emotional response. And it is definitely an emotional response. But our brain communicates to our mast cells through our neurons. And neurons and mast cells are always talking back and forth to one another. So, I talked about how mast cells release all these signaling molecules. So that's how they're talking to neurons. And neurons likewise are releasing substances that can communicate with the mast cells. So that sensitization of the mast cells can definitely come from like a brain response.
Yeah. Wow. Big stuff. And I love in epigenetics in there. So epigenetics is to do with the environment, isn't it? It's like, doesn't epi mean above genetics or to the side of genetic? I can't remember what the epi part means, but
Yeah.
I know it's to do with belief and environment, not actually the code.
So the way I explain epigenetics, and my knowledge is quite limited, but if you think of your genes as being, the dimmer light switches where you can change how strong the lights are on or off, epigenetic factors. So these are things like diet, exercise, are you a smoker or not? How do you manage stress? Like all of these factors, how many toxins are in your environment? All of these external factors have the ability to turn your genes on or off, to dim them or to have them on really bright. So ideally, we want disease contributing genes to be dimmed, right? We want those ones to be off. And we want the health promoting genes to be expressed, to be on. And so all of these, this whole variety of factors are known to influence that.
Right. Okay. This is good. So, if you have mast cell activation syndrome, I'm just going to call it MCAS.
Yeah.
Is a low histamine diet something that you should be on?
Yes, yes. And so this is actually where I'd meant to talk about this earlier, but this is where I think there's a lot of maybe misdiagnoses. And I should really clarify that both Luka and I are not qualified to diagnose, so we just provide education for people. But a low histamine diet is very beneficial for people with MCAS because the mast cells have receptors on them for histamine. So, and this is how cells communicate with one another. Something, these signaling molecules have to bind to a receptor on a cell. And so you eat food high in histamine, that histamine enters your blood circulation, goes to tissue, binds onto the mast cells, and can then trigger the release of a variety of chemical mediators, including more histamine. So reducing histamine intake is one way to help manage mast cell activation syndrome. And so this is where, I think Luke and I have worked with people who have come to us and said, oh, I have histamine intolerance. But often, as we start to explore things more deeply, it probably looks like they in reality have MCAS. And so the way I sort of try to determine this, again, I'm not qualified to diagnose, but if I have a client who responds really well to a low histamine diet, along with maybe a diamine oxidase enzyme, so the enzyme that breaks down histamine, if their symptoms resolve and are managed with just those two interventions, then, in all likelihood, they just have histamine intolerance.
Okay.
If a low histamine diet is just taking the edge off things or just improving things a little bit, then, I think there's so much more to explore. And, we've just talked about this whole trauma piece, like this idea of creating safety in the body. Like I can't overemphasize the importance of this. And this is often a long journey. I'm 3 years into my journey now, and I'm still working on, calming everything and that feeling of safety within my body. So yeah, lots of work, lots of different practitioners need to be involved in that whole journey as well.
it's not just about diet, is it?
No.
When we're looking at, really transforming this issue, we have to go,
Yes.
we have to go beyond nutrition into, doing the deeper work, looking at where the body doesn't feel safe, where it doesn't feel
Hmm.
supported, where it needs more rest
Yes.
and less kind of fraughtness, which our daily lives tend to bring about. So I'm really just kind of, diving deeper into this subject of rest giving you more, because we're so,
Hmm.
we believe that when we're resting, we're not doing anything, we're wasting time, we're being lazy, things need doing, we need to be more productive. If we don't get up and take action, then we'll pay for it later on. But actually, I'm starting to deconstruct all of that and realize that rest is giving me so much more. Rest is, it's almost like giving the universe an opportunity to wave its magic. So if I'm trying to force life and trying to force getting clients or trying to force some kind of deal, then the more I try, the more I push it away. So
Hmm.
sometimes for me, just taking that 20 minutes or just not looking at the computer or just, moving away and taking some time for myself actually does more in the long run for my flow.
Yes, I'm so glad you brought that up, because we have this idea that, yeah, like you said, rest is you're being lazy, you're not being productive, but it is such a restorative act, and something to, yeah, just tell your body, like, this is just a time for me, I love you, you are safe, right? Like, it's, yeah, it's so valuable.
Yeah, a lot of it is the words and the pictures that you have in your mind. If you constantly have those sort of horrific pictures or pictures of struggle or pictures of I've got to get things done, then that's what you're going to be programming in. And I really do believe you cannot separate the mind and body. They are
Mm,
one. They are one. Like, we've heard it said time and time again, but this MCAS stuff that you're talking about is living proof that we literally are one. The mind and body is inextricably connected.
yes, yes. And the mast cells are really, really key in that connection. The mast cells are that connection between our nervous system and our immune system. And nervous system, again, that's like, what we think of as the brain. Yeah, yeah, intimately into, you cannot cannot separate the two things. Yeah.
Yeah, I love that you've said that, and that just makes
And
so much sense. Go on.
yeah, and I should actually, this might resonate with people as well. Chronic pain is such a huge, huge part of MCAS. So whether that's, headache pain or joint pain or abdominal pain, chest pain, there's so many ways that pain can show up with people who have mast cell activation syndrome. And that is that same connection, except it's the peripheral sensing nerves, right, that are involved there. So it's still the neurons and the mast cells communicating. So mast cells, within that communication, mast cells are kind of ramping up that pain response. So that's another way that the mast cells in the nervous system, when they're communicating away, it shows up in the body.
Okay, okay. You've hinted at there being foods that trigger mast cells. So,
Yeah. So we've talked about high histamine foods.
mhm.
So that definitely can be a trigger for mast cells. There's something in foods called lectins, and lectins we find in plant foods, but really predominantly in grains and legumes. And so, and sometimes people think, oh, should I go gluten free? But Luka and I actually really advocate for a grain free approach.
Hmm.
So lectins, in addition to potentially being a trigger for mast cell activation, they can also contribute to leaky gut. And that's where you make diamine oxidase, the enzyme that breaks down histamine. So there's a few different ways that lectins can kind of contribute to the whole cascade. And then another trigger, we've talked about mold, sort of environmental mold, but there are foods that can have mold. So grapes would be one that's quite common. Nuts and seeds can have mold, and it may not be a visible mold. There are cheeses that have mold, but mold in foods is another one that can be a trigger as well. So this is where the dietary protocol that Luka and I have created, I think, is really quite unique and different from other low histamine approaches, because we have tried to build everything in. All of the triggers, all the potential triggers are gone. And our protocol is a 3-stage protocol, so that you move through the stages and you can start to explore your body and discover what your triggers are. So, and this process of self-discovery is really, really important, because every single person who has MCAS is going to have different triggers.
Yeah.
Even like, I know you've talked about dark chocolate in the past. And so I seem to do okay with a little bit of dark chocolate. Other people that I've met cannot tolerate it. And then, on the flip side, I do terribly with beef. So if I have beef, I cannot sleep at night. Like, I'm agitated, I'm awake. Other people do just fine with beef. So you have to go through this process of self-discovery and, slowly start to reintroduce foods and figure out what really works for your body, because ultimately we want the most abundance. Our planet has provided us with so many amazing foods. So we want to bring in as many of those foods as we can and manage symptoms. So it's about bringing in that abundance and still being able to control or manage your symptoms.
Because I think that's why that's an objection, isn't it? When people think, oh God, it's going to be too restrictive, I'm not going to bother. That's going to be a big sort of block for a lot of people. How do you get around that?
Yeah.
We spoke about intuitive eating on the last podcast. I wonder if that's something to do with it.
So I think, well, one thing, yes, intuitive eating is important, but let me share my own story with you, because it took me, I talked about urinary urgency as the symptom that developed when I started eating more fermented foods. It took me months and months to piece that together. And it wasn't until, so I will be right up front and tell you, I'm on 3 pharmaceuticals to manage my mast cell issues. It wasn't until I was on pharmaceuticals and doing a low histamine diet, and trying to identify and avoid my triggers, that inflammation came down enough in my body that I could be in that intuitive place.
Okay.
Because because I've struggled with this my whole life, I was inflamed. It was my normal. And because it was my normal, I couldn't recognize it unless I had a really significant flare, like I broke out in hives, or, my eczema went through a big flare. But on a day-to-day basis, that intuitive ability, and it was really surprising for me to actually learn that I didn't have that, because, all my life I've heard from different practitioners, oh, like you have so much awareness. But when it came to food, I didn't, because as we've just talked about, there's so many potential food triggers. And it wasn't until, again, like I had to be on pharmaceuticals and, doing the diet. And like, I also take diamine oxidase and, other supplements to stabilize my mast cells, that I could actually get to a place where I would notice, like, oh, I had beef and I couldn't sleep that night. Or, I had a banana and, it triggered these symptoms. So it's such a journey. It's just not sometimes as simple as trying to listen
Yeah.
to your body. And so, when we talk about, like, again, this idea, where people are like, oh, like, this just is too overwhelming, it's too restrictive. I will tell you that Luka and I can come up with a variation of your favorite food, right? Like, there is so much abundance in the world. You just have to explore it and find replacement. So it's not about restriction, it's about replacement and focusing on the abundance that exists. So, we have our cookbook should be coming out in the next little bit. And, we have pizza recipes, and we have, luscious, indulgent desserts. And so we've kind of tried to take a lot of those favorite comfort foods, and just find a replacement version of it for people.
Yeah.
So that's really the approach that we come to it with. Yeah.
I absolutely love that. And I can't wait to get your book. I know I sent you a message a while back. I was like, I need your book right now. I know you have to wait because I know it's just going to be amazing. And I know you and Luka you've really thought about this, and you've both been through it yourselves. And what I love about you two is you're real problem solvers, and you're not just going to sit back and be victims of this. You're actually proactive, you're solving these problems. The problem of the restrictive diet, you've flipped it and you've gone, well, hang on a minute, we live in an abundant world.
Mm-hmm.
And we have all of this produce around us that we can use and utilize, so why not? I saw you on Instagram eating a dragon fruit a while back. I take it that's a low histamine food.
It is, yeah, and it's certainly not something we get in Canada all that often. So when I saw it, I was like, beautiful.
Having that.
Yes.
So you mentioned that you're on pharmaceuticals. Can I ask what pharmaceuticals help with mast cell activation syndrome?
Yeah, so I think probably the first line of defense that any doctor who has experience with MCAS will try are antihistamines. And there's two, I'll call them histamine blockers. So the first is an H1 blocker, and this is what we know as an antihistamine. And there are, with some people who are really highly sensitive, they may have to work with their doctor and trial different types of antihistamines. And this is really important to recognize, because I hate to see people who like give up, early on, because they're like, well, it didn't work. Well, if it didn't work, go back and talk to your doctor again. The doctors that are educating themselves about MCAS, they're doing a very good job, right? They are brilliant people. So H1 blockers, known as antihistamines. The next thing is an H2 blocker. This would be most commonly known as like an acid, like a heartburn medication. So it is still a histamine blocker. It's just blocking a different histamine receptor. So that's why we have like H1 blockers. They block these H1 receptors. And then H2 blockers are blocking a different histamine receptor. There are other receptors. We also have two other receptors. They're just numbered 3 and 4, but unfortunately at this time we don't have pharmaceuticals commercially available. But so that's, again, this is what most doctors would start you on, would be an H1 and an H2 blocker. Then there's something called ketotifen, which is a combination antihistamine and mast cell stabilizer. I should also point out that myself and many other people with MCAS cannot do the over-the-counter versions of these. So you may not be able to do a regular antihistamine just because you're sensitive to the additional ingredients in there. So it may be pertinent to get a doctor who can write out a compounded prescription. And you would then also need a compounding pharmacy that can, put that together. There's another drug called cromolyn that is used quite widely. It does not have a great absorption rate. Some people still really benefit from it. It seems to have the most benefit within the GI tract. You have a lot of mast cells in the GI tract, and even though it's not absorbed, it can still help. So for people who have a lot of GI symptoms, cromolyn would be another one. And then there's a lot of other drugs that get used, but mostly from a symptom management perspective. So doctors will then customize, say you've got extremely high blood pressure or extremely low blood pressure. You can have both with MCAS. You can have these complete opposites in different individuals. So then, doctors will try to manage your symptoms so that, your quality of life is improved as they start to address all of these underlying factors, all of these toxins and trauma and, mold exposure, all of these things we've been talking about. The approach would be like, get somebody on pharmaceuticals so that they can feel well. Because if you don't feel well enough to start to make changes in your life, right, you can't progress anywhere. So it's that kind of management approach. And then let's just address everything that's at the root of this and create that feeling of safety in the body.
Yeah, it makes perfect sense. I don't think, it's such a hard job to go from being really poorly and not really being able to function to being able to flourish and thrive. That it's a road that you have to walk down, and that often begins with medication to get yourself out of the hole, out of the quicksand, onto dry land, so that you can actually start moving towards feeling healthy in yourself again. So I think it's great that we've spoken about those pharmaceuticals, because I think some people will definitely be interested in going down that road short term.
And, to be honest with you, as a holistic nutrition practitioner, I was like, I don't want to be on pharmaceuticals, but they have made such a difference for me in terms of my quality of life, my symptom management. And so, I hope to eventually wean myself off them. But I know, like I said, this is a journey. It takes a while. I still have, I'm partway there, but I still have work to do.
So what are some of your self-care practices that you do? We're going to wrap things up, and I'd like you to share some of the nice things that you do to help yourself to feel better, just to inspire other people who are listening.
So I have an infrared sauna. So I love to sauna. Now, not everybody with MCAS can do heat. So that's a consideration, but I go in there and I put some meditational music on, and it's just a place for me to have quiet and, therapeutically be kind of detoxing. So I really enjoy sauna. I also really enjoy an Epsom salt bath. And, for people who don't tolerate heat, again, an Epsom salt bath can be difficult, but you can just do a foot bath. Put some Epsom salts in and give that a try. In the summertime, so when you were talking about, taking these little rests, I have a hammock in my backyard, and I find it so restorative to just take 15 or 20 minutes to go lie on my hammock. And I close my eyes and I watch the sunlight patterns inside my eyelids.
Wow.
And I know it sounds really odd, but I feel like the sun for me has such healing power. And when I feel connected to the sun and its energy, like it's just so restorative for me. So really any time outside, but that, I specifically set a time outside in my hammock as just a restorative time.
Yeah, no, I couldn't agree more. I think there's something about that U shape and being held and supported and cocooned in
Mm-hmm,
a hammock.
mm-hmm.
And it's very raw, it's very out in nature, it's quite primal.
Yeah. And, you know, the other thing I do, which I haven't been able to do with COVID, but I will be getting back to it in a couple of weeks, is dancing. And I love to dance. I've danced most of my adult life. And dancing, you know, if you look at dance from like an energetic perspective, it's grounding.
Yeah.
It's and so I love, I mean, I did Bollywood for a number of years, but ballroom is kind of where my heart really is. And the thing that's so lovely about ballroom dancing, I mean, it still has this grounding aspect, but you are physically connected to another person. So
Mm.
that sense of, you know, that physical touch, that connection to other people is, I think dance just has incredible potential, just, you know, for like restoration and repair and all of these lovely health giving properties, as well. So that's something else I love to do.
I never considered that actually, but yeah, dancing with another where there's contact will probably stimulate the vagus nerve and that sense of safety. So I guess,
Hmm.
and massage and other things where you're actually physically being touched.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah, love that. That's given me some inspiration because I did dance for a while. I was doing street dance, which I loved, but I had to stop it for a reason I'm not going to go into. But I was thinking of restarting it again, and I was thinking of maybe doing a different style of dance. I've always been really intrigued and interested in contemporary dance because it feels
Hmm.
a lot more like emotionally expressive and real and authentic, and so something like that just and now I know there's a it's going to help my mast cells as well. So why not? So
Yeah.
brilliant. Well, thank you so much. And if people are, you know, perhaps sort of their ears have pricked up because of this conversation and they want to learn more, I highly recommend you have a look at the Histamine Haven account on Instagram. But if they resonate with you and want to work with you specifically, how can they find out about you?
So, Luka and I, on our website, Histamine Haven, um, there is a page where you can click on either Luka or myself to connect with us. So yeah, that would be the easiest way to do that. And we've tried to put a lot of you know, accessible resources on our website as well. So that's a really great starting place for people for sure.
But I
Yeah.
think if you're serious about this, I think you really need to get some help because I was looking at this and I bought a book. I was like, there's no way I can do this by myself. I don't have the mojo at the moment and the information and the inspiration to do all of this. You need a specific set of guidelines. You need specific recipes. You cannot just do this on your own. So your book,
Hmm.
which
Hmm.
is coming out, will be great, but also whatever you do between you that enables people. Do you have a group program?
We have, yeah, we have several group programs, and we've just launched something we're calling office hours. So office hours are for people who've, you know, started maybe a dietary approach, or their doctors, you know, got them started on that, or maybe they've done one of our programs and they just need that ongoing place to ask questions, to maybe be held accountable and motivated. So that's a recent launch for us.
That sounds great. Really good. All right, Tracy. Well, thank you so much for that, you know, amazing interview, all of your incredible insights. I love the way you speak as well. You're nice and slow, and it's because it's quite a meaty brain topic, this.
It
And
is.
yeah, you've given us a lot of thinking time to process. So thank you for that.
Well, thank you so much for having me on. It's just such a pleasure to be able to share this topic and get the word out. I think it's a common condition. I think much more common than anybody realizes, and it's just really, really important that people are educated. So thank you.
So I really hope you enjoyed that conversation and you're feeling inspired now to create a safe environment for your beautiful, incredible body to live in so that it can find balance and homeostasis again. Now, maybe you've been motivated to find out more about working with Tracey or Luka from Histamine Haven, or maybe you're feeling curious to know how rapid transformational therapy can help with inflammatory and immune system issues too. So RTT is a wonderful process that can help put you back in the driver's seat of your physiology. Many people who work with me report a feeling of truly becoming at home with themselves after working with me for 30 days. At the heart of an overactive immune system is a feeling that the body needs to defend itself. It's holding on tightly. But when we take a deep dive under hypnosis and really do the inner work, we can let go of that protector part so that the body can finally learn how to relax, surrender, and live authentically. It's what your body and your mind have been longing for. Now, it's important to understand that the mind and the body literally are one. And it's no longer viable to think of fixing physical problems by only addressing the physical aspects of your life. Addressing long-term chronic issues like the one spoken about today, we simply have to go deeper. And rapid transformational therapy is one of the most effective therapies I've seen that can do this. So if you're feeling like this could be a good time for you to explore RTT, then just go to the link in the show notes or visit my brand new look website, sallygarozzo.com. Remember, if you're liking these podcasts and you really believe in getting the word out there about menopause, midlife and mental health, then please subscribe and leave a review. It just means that we get to reach out to more people who need to hear this message. And happy people means a happy world. Your interaction might very well help to save another person's sanity. Please share this and I'll see you next week. Bye for now.